Hello, welcome to Pause for Faith. It's good to be with you.
For faith. It's good.
Check all my settings. I think we're good. Nice to have this time with you. If you're watching live, it'll make sense why I'm speaking about St. Thomas More today, because we've just had the feast day of St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More. And I wasn't able to speak about them on the day, but a couple of days ago, I gave some thoughts about the life of St. John Fisher, and it's great to have some time now speaking about St. Thomas More, and just to share a little bit about his life with you, in case you don't know his story well. Just again, I said this 2 days ago, speaking about John Fisher, but what a wonderful pair. Their feast day is the joint feast day of John Fisher and Thomas More, a priest and a layman, a pastor, a scholar, and a lawyer, a statesman, and both of them at the heart of the Catholic faith in this country, and wonderful saints showing us the different ways that the Christian vocation can be lived out and the different Christian vocations. And just here am I sitting in Newman House Chaplaincy, just next to Tottenham Court Road, a mile from St. Paul's in the city, a couple of miles down the river to Chelsea, where Thomas More's house was. Just to note that without being too London-centric, St. Thomas More is thoroughly a saint of London, of this city. He walked these streets. This was his home, his whole life. I don't know whether he walked up Gower Street. I think it was probably some fields then outside the door here. But just certainly growing up in London, as we'll hear about now, and then his famous, beautiful, great house on the riverbanks of the River Thames in Chelsea. This is his home. This is his world. St. Thomas More was born in 1478. He was the only surviving son of Sir John More, a barrister of Cheapside in London. He was rooted in the city, meaning that the little city, not this huge, vast metropolis that we know as London now, but the city of London itself, with the medieval walls around it. The city of London, which in terms of London now is in the east. He went to school in Threadneedle Street, and at the age of 13 was placed in the household of Archbishop Morton. This would have been part of his growing up, his education for aspiring young men, older boys, to have some time in the house of a great noble or an archbishop, to learn the ways of the world, of society, of politics, and to continue their education in this way. But at 14, Thomas went to Canterbury Hall in Oxford, which later became part of Christ Church. So go to Oxford today, the incredible Christ Church College, those vast fields by the river there. You can walk around thinking this is, in effect, where St. Thomas More was. He went at the very young age of 14, not uncommon. Remember, John Fisher went to Cambridge when he was 15. But he had 2 very happy years in Oxford there, really absorbed in what was called the new learning, this great enthusiasm, what we call the humanist movement, this great enthusiasm for the learning of Greek, for understanding the classical culture out of which the Western culture emerged, for going back to the sources, for doing history and textual criticism. It really was an incredible time of learning in the 14th and 15th, in the 15th and early 16th centuries. But he got so enthusiastic in Oxford about this learning and this scholarship that his very practical lawyer father became worried about him. He wasn't happy there. Sorry, Thomas More was happy, but his father wasn't happy with him getting lost in these studies and these new enthusiasms. And he pulled him out of Oxford and sent him to law school in London 2 years later when he was 16. So I'm going to mention this thread a couple of times, which is, he seems so distant from us, Thomas More, the world of the late 15th century, the late 1400s, but lots of the issues and the joys and the disputes are very, very modern. So here we are, there is a conflict between a parent and their child about what they will study and where their future is taking them. An argument, a disagreement, and the father stamping his authority on his son and pulling him out of university, sending him somewhere else. I hear this a lot. I'm a university chaplain. The tensions between what parents want the children to do. Some students come from cultures where there's great freedom, certainly here in Britain. On the whole, students would choose the subjects they found most interesting, and it's rare for a British student to have a parent force them to do a subject they don't want to do. But it's much more common in other cultures where there's a sense of responsibility of doing what the parent wants, and there's if you like, a closer family culture and an expectation in that sense. So Thomas goes back to London, studies law, and he's as brilliant a lawyer as he was a classical scholar. He's just highly intelligent, highly competent. Soon he's lecturing in law. He's still keeping up his interest in humanism, in the new learning. He lectured on St. Augustine in London. He knew, even as a young man, he's still only in his early 20s, he knew the good and the great of London. He was developing a reputation as a lawyer, a scholar, a teacher. He met Erasmus. Again, all these connections. I was speaking about Erasmus being a friend with St. John Fisher and visiting Cambridge. Erasmus would come to London very often, and Thomas More, they befriended each other. They talked about theology, they read Greek together, and they tried to reconcile, this is so important, the traditions of Catholic learning and teaching and theology and philosophy with the new discoveries of classical scholarship from the Greek and the Latin worlds. So it's trying to integrate these two great visions of life and civilization and learning, rather than to see them as conflict. Of course, they were seeing the world in different ways, but to believe that they could be reconciled. That was so important in this late movement. You can call this, if you like, either the new humanism or the late period of the Renaissance, Catholic scholars trying to integrate the new learning, or put it another way, the classical learning, with the great tradition of Catholic philosophy and theology, and believing that can be done. Just as in the 12th and the 13th centuries, scholars throughout Europe were trying to integrate the early Renaissance, the classical learning, the translations of Greek and Latin thinkers and writers that were coming, especially through Muslim scholars, into Europe at the time. St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas being at the heart of this. So Erasmus is a monk, Thomas More is a layman through and through, but he was very attracted to monastic life. He lived in London near the Charterhouse. We still have a place called Charterhouse, and that's because the Carthusian monastery was at the heart of London then. He would take part in the spiritual exercises of the Carthusians. He wore famously a hair shirt. He limited his sleep. He was living quite an ascetic life, and in his heart, it seems, moving towards possibly becoming a monk. But again, it was his father who insisted that he should marry and pursue a secular career. And as I say, we don't have evidence that Thomas was unhappy with this. He accepted this, took this to be his vocation. Thomas More married Jane Colt from Netherhall in Essex. They were married, had a family, 4 children, and very tragically, Jane died after only 4 years of marriage. And Thomas was left there with these 4 young children, and he married within 1 month of his wife's death. Now, we might think today that would be a little bit hasty, yes? You've got your standard 6-month period that you need of engagement and preparation in terms of church customs today. But it was just very pragmatic, and it was not uncommon in those days. His family needed a mistress of the house. His children needed a mother. He needed a wife, inverted commas, but more than that, wife this is very much in the 16th century terms of someone who would manage his household, because that was one of the roles. in those days. So just there was Thomas More with this great need for support for his family, and he married his second wife, Alice Middleton. I'm quoting here, a good plain woman 7 years older than him, who would be a mother for the children and a competent housekeeper. So no evidence at all that there was a lack of love and affection, and there was a deep love and affection that grew and grew, but it was very clearly a quick, pragmatic decision to give to his children and his family all that they needed in the light of the tragedy of his first wife's death. So there we are in his new household, Thomas More, his career growing, in his second marriage, the children growing up. Just to note here that he wasn't unique in this, but he was famous for educating his daughters as much as his son. Because, quote, it was a reasonable thing, he said, recommended by the prudent and holy ancients, such as Jerome and St. Augustine. His house was a centre of learning and hospitality and prayer. Famous scholars and people of influence like Linacre and Colet and St. John Fisher, Bishop John Fisher, came to visit. Erasmus would stay at his home. Very often Thomas More would invite his poorer neighbours to dine. The household, including his servants, the whole community, met for daily prayers. At the meals, one of the children would read from the Holy Scriptures. If your parents listening, you can try this at home. Will it work? Who knows? It's worth trying. I know of some families that have a children's Bible on the kitchen table, and they will get the children to read a paragraph or a page over supper. It's not possible for everyone, but just it's nice to dream and experiment with these things. There was a chapel in his house. He would serve at the altar, a humble layman serving, even when he was Lord Chancellor. He slept on the floor with a log for a pillow. And I'm reading here, he spent all his Fridays in prayer. So he was living a thoroughly worldly, secular life, in the neutral sense of those words, immersed in politics, law, governance, culture, scholarship, thoroughly immersed in family life, the love of his family, of his wife, of his children, of his community, and living a very, very devout life as a layman, thoroughly centred on prayer and on the Lord and on his Catholic faith and on the Scriptures. This is St. Thomas More. I speak about his house. I can't remember the year, but he lived in central London, in London itself. But at a certain point, when he was, I can't remember if it's just when he became Lord Chancellor or if it was before that, but he's earning more. He's a man of great stature, and he didn't just buy a house. He bought some land and he consolidated lots of different farms and pieces of property in West London, way out of the city, way past Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament. So this is in Chelsea, what we know as Chelsea now. And on the river there, his great estate was built, and he built what was called the Great House. And this was, it's in London now, but it felt like a country house just outside the city on the river. And when we speak often about Thomas More's home, this is where we mean. This is where the famous paintings of Holbein were done, all of them, of his family, of Thomas More, the group painting, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. It was a kind of hanging, but we've got what's called cartoons, Holbein's original cartoons that do still exist. The group portraits that took place, and this lovely scene with Thomas More and his household sitting together, this would have been in the Great House in Chelsea. The sketches, at least for the famous paintings, that the marvellous portrait of Thomas More, Holbein did 2 or 3, I can't remember, but the one I've seen is the famous one in the Frick collection in New York, and it's extraordinary to see it in real life, not just a reproduction. This is the Great House. And just a personal note here, me sitting in London, for 8 years I taught at Allen Hall Seminary. And one of the wonderful connections is that Allen Hall Seminary in Chelsea is built exactly on the site where the Great Hall stood. And all the streets around there are the land of St Thomas More's property. So there's a lovely connection between this sanctified history of St Thomas More's home and our seminary today. You can see little bits of the garden wall from the time of St Thomas More. His house doesn't exist anymore. You can see the mulberry orchard that he planted. There's a tree that it's said he sat under. I hate to admit this, but we're not 100% sure. But we are 100% sure that the mulberry trees are very old and that he planted the mulberry orchard, because mulberry and more, there's a play on the word there in the Latin. So here he is, his career flourishing. In 1510, with the young King Henry VIII on the throne, he's elected a reader of Lincoln's Inn and appointed under-sheriff of London. He's given a knighthood. He is appointed to different public offices. He's a kind of a negotiator. I can't find the right word. He went on a trade delegation to the Netherlands. It was almost like a sabbatical from his law work. This is when he wrote his famous book, Utopia. Too much to go into now, but just he was still writing, not heavy works of scholarship like St John Fisher and the academics in Oxford and Cambridge, but serious works of polemic and of wit. Thomas was mainly a lawyer, a statesman, a politician, but he was writing and influencing, again, as we'd say today. He became close friends with Henry VIII. They had so much in common, a love of learning, a care, sincere care for the good of the country, for politics, for statesmanship in its best word sense. And Henry VIII, don't forget, had a deep faith and a great love for the Catholic faith. And he was united with John Fisher and Thomas More in his love for learning, his love for the church, and his love for the Catholic faith against the teachings that were coming in to unsettle this Catholic consensus from the Protestant movement in the continent. He was promoted in 1529 to become Lord Chancellor of England. This was the highest public office. Lord Chancellor, I guess it's not exactly the same, but technically it would be more like becoming Prime Minister today. Yeah, the highest public office, and here Thomas More is. He worked in the legal profession. Obviously, he's a lawyer, but he's thoroughly involved in political life, in doing the will of the king, in negotiating between king and parliament. He served with great integrity and scrupulous fairness. There is lots of controversy about his role in difficult decisions, in the persecution and judgment of Protestants and heretics and book burning and executions. And honestly, hand on my heart here, it's too complicated to go into now. There is I haven't read Wolf Hall, but just I understand there's a very dark picture of Thomas More in Wolf Hall. You can read a Catholic hagiography, and it's as if Thomas More was completely disconnected from the raw realities of political life, which were very difficult, some of them. So I'm not trying to pretend everything was uncomplicated. I think certainly we can trust his conscience in that he was trying, from everything we know, to act with great integrity, with scrupulous fairness, to be a fair lawyer, a just judge, to be a man of integrity, of someone who followed his conscience, was trying to live his Christian values. I won't simply say he was a man of his time, as if that means that he never made a bad decision or he wasn't influenced by some of the negative currents of his time. So as I say, hand on my heart, it's a complicated story, but what we can know from the historical record and from our understanding of what we know of him as a saint is that he always acted with integrity and, as far as he could see it, with great justice. So here he is, and things are going swimmingly. Yes, what more could a man want in worldly terms? And then the difficulties start. This is not really, again, being technical, this isn't so much about the Protestant Reformation. This is about the struggles of Henry VIII, the politics of the time, and his desire to receive an annulment from the Pope for his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn legitimately and produce an heir with Anne Boleyn to the throne. So this was very, very much about the king, his marriage crisis, the internal politics of the land. And it wasn't at first about theology and philosophy and Protestantism. Long story short, Henry VIII eventually imposed on the clergy the acknowledgement of himself as king, as protector and supreme head of the church. Protector and supreme head of the church. So in effect, it's bringing all of the spiritual as well as the political authority to himself and separating the church in England from the communion of the wider universal church and from the spiritual and teaching authority of the Pope in Rome and the unity of the Catholic Church. Bishop John Fisher added the phrase, "so far as the law of Christ allows." So John Fisher knew that many priests, especially, and bishops would and lay people would find it difficult to accept this. So he said, maybe we can say that the king is protector and supreme head of the church as far as the law of Christ allows. More was very uneasy. He knew things were going to get difficult and he wanted to resign his office. He just wanted to say, this is not a situation that I can find a way through. I want to resign and live a quiet life of scholarship. He was persuaded not to resign, but in the end, it wasn't possible to stay completely silent. More defended the validity of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but he did it cautiously. Interestingly, in March 1531, he had to explain the case to the Houses of Parliament. The members of Parliament wanted to know what's going on, what is this marriage situation? And Thomas More explained the case, gave both sides, but refused to give his own opinion. He refused to be tied, even though he knew what it was. But more and more he found himself obliged to oppose the king's wishes, and eventually the king, greatly angered, accepted his resignation. He had held office as Lord Chancellor for less than 3 years. The loss of salary, Thomas More is now resigned, reduced More and his household to poverty. For 18 months, he lived very quietly. Basically, he tried to hide from the disputes. He refused to attend the coronation of Anne Boleyn, but like John Fisher, he was subject to persecution. He always felt, because he was such a good lawyer and he knew the law so well, that ultimately the law would protect him as long as he kept to himself his controversial opinions that might have seemed treasonous. The breaking point came when he was summoned to Lambeth Palace on the River Thames, just near to Millbank, near to the Houses of Parliament. He was summoned to take the oath of succession on the 13th of April, 1534. Now, this is important. The act of succession, Henry VIII's act of succession, forced you to recognise that Anne Boleyn was his lawful wife and that their children would be legitimate heirs. And Thomas More and John Fisher even were open to accepting that. But the oath of succession, it's not the exact language, but the oath that people were forced to sign after the act, it went even further, and it asked the person who was signing not just to accept the children of Anne Boleyn as legitimate heirs, but to renounce the power of any foreign authority or potentate. Basically, you had to renounce any influence of any foreign power, in effect including to renounce the authority of the Pope, even in spiritual matters in England. And that was the breaking point, because to sign that, you had to say, in effect, that the role of the Pope and the universal unity of the church didn't matter anymore, and you could have an independent church with its own head, King Henry VIII. And that was what Thomas More and John Fisher and many others felt that they couldn't accept, because it was a betrayal of the ordinary mainstream Catholic Christian understanding of what it meant to be Christian. Again, we can talk about this in terms of theology, but in terms of history and politics, this is the oath that John Fisher and Thomas More couldn't sign. The famous scene, just a little footnote here, of Thomas More being summoned to Lambeth Palace to sign the oath. And this was a fantastic scene in the play and the film, A Man for All Seasons. I think in the film, maybe in the play, it was the opening scene. Did they do it in kind of reverse? But anyway, Thomas More's walking in the garden at Chelsea, which I know so well from living there for 8 years at Allen Hall, beneath his mulberry trees, and the message comes that the boat is waiting for him to be taken to Lambeth Palace, and he knows this is the end. He knows this is the end, and he will never see his house or his family. He'll see one or two of them in prison. But this is saying goodbye to his house, his family, his world, and he gets on the boat, the river taxi, and goes to Lambeth Palace. He refused to sign, but he didn't say why. Again, he believed that he would be safe as long as he said nothing that could condemn him as being a traitor. I'm not signing, but that's not treason. I'm not telling you why I'm not signing. Eventually, because he refused to sign a second time, he was taken to the Tower of London, and he lived there. He was kept there for 15 months. I've been very privileged. We went with a group from the seminary to visit the cell where St. Thomas More was kept. It is kept as a bare, empty cell today. Thank God they haven't just put a gift shop in it or something. Sadly, it's not part of the normal public tour. You have to get special permission and all these kind of notifications. But it is possible, if you have, I don't know whether it's the right connections or if you go about it in the right way, to see his cell. And it's such a privilege to be in the cell that this saint lived in, and to feel that connection with St. Thomas More, and to know this was where he spent his last 15 months. This time in the cell, it was marked by a quiet serenity. There was no anger. There was lots of thinking and writing, but there was a serenity and acceptance, and still the hope that he could save himself, that God would save him, and that he would be spared execution. And the other thing that marked this time, she's not the only person he saw, but was the great love he had for his eldest daughter, Margaret. The visits that she had, the letters that she wrote to him, that they wrote to each other, and the conversations that were recorded very faithfully by her husband, William Roper. And remember that in this time in the Tower, when execution seems imminent, his family are constantly trying to persuade him to sign the oath. They're not, in that sense, supporting him, because they thought, what does it matter? It's just a signature. Everyone knows you don't believe it, Thomas. You're not really betraying your faith, because everyone knows what your faith is. We know this is just pragmatic. And think of the suffering of yourself, but of your family, of your friends, his wife and children living in poverty because he was in the Tower, and even worse if he is condemned for treason and is executed. So here is someone, and it's very, very common, trying to follow their conscience and do what they believe is right, and finding that instead of support, even from their fellow Christians and family, the people they'd expect it from most, they're getting opposition. So the loneliness and the isolation that come when you're trying to do what is right very often. It reminds me of the great, I've just finished a biography of Franz Jägerstätter, Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, that marvellous Austrian saint who gave his life because he refused to fight for the Nazis in the war. And that marvelous film, A Hidden Life, which you can see, it was very, very similar. His wife Fanny stood by him, but the opposition of everyone else to his decision, his bishop trying to persuade him to go along with the Nazi war machine, his priest saying you can do this in good conscience, all his relations and his fellow townspeople saying, how can you do this to your family? And him saying, I need to stand up for the truth and I can't go against my conscience. At his trial, he said to the jury, quote, "Ye must understand that in things touching conscience, every true and good subject is more bound to have respect to his said conscience and to his soul than to any other thing in all the world besides." His trial took place in Westminster Hall on the 1st of July, 1535. So, notice the dates. I think I've got this right. It was the week before that John Fisher was executed. They were both in the Tower, and as I remember, Thomas More saw John Fisher walking to his execution. So he knew that the great Bishop Fisher, even his greatness, his holiness, his status as a bishop, had not stopped Henry killing him. That's when he knew things were getting bad. The trial took place on the 1st of July in Westminster Hall. Isn't it incredible that Westminster Hall still exists? It's still there, thank God, and they saved it from the fire, the famous fire. You can go there and you can stand in the place where Thomas More stood when he was tried. Very moving. He refused to say why he wouldn't take the oath. He was found guilty on false evidence. The evidence of, was it Rex? I've forgotten his name. Is all in the wonderful play in the film A Man for All Seasons, as well as in the transcripts from the trial that you can read. But then at last, when he was condemned to death, then he spoke. He knew there was no point in hiding his true views then. He denied categorically that a temporal lord could or ought to be head of the spirituality, old-fashioned language here. Basically, he said, I'm dying for the defense of the unity of the church and the fact that we don't believe in, this is Thomas More, my words, but his faith, we don't believe in national churches. We believe in the church, Christ's church. Yes, different churches and communities, but united with the successor of St. Peter, the Pope. This has been the ordinary, consistent faith of Christendom for 1,500 years, for 1,600 years. It's what Thomas More believes to be the truth, and it's what he died for, in his own words. And then he said, not to be antagonistic, the beauty of this quote, he said, just as St. Paul had persecuted St. Stephen, quote, and yet they be now both twain holy saints in heaven, and shall continue their friends forever. So I verily trust, and shall therefore right heartily pray, that though your lordships have here now on earth been judges of my condemnation, we may yet hereafter in heaven merrily all meet together in everlasting salvation. Isn't that moving? The people who just condemned him to death, he said, may we be as saints loving the Lord together and meet one day in heaven. He was taken back to the Tower. 4 days later, he was told he would die that day. He put on his best clothes, walked to the Tower Hill within the yard of the Tower, speaking to people on his way, walked up to the scaffold, asked for the prayers of the people. He said that he died for the Holy Catholic Church. He said famously, he is the King's good servant, but God's first. He prayed the psalm, the Miserere, comforted the executioner, covered his own eyes, and then was beheaded at the age of 57 years old. His body was buried in the chapel there in Tower. So we don't know exactly where his bones are, but when you go to the little chapel of St. Peter, the irony there, the chapel of St. Peter, ad vincula, within the tower, in this, it's horrible really, this pit where the bodies of the condemned were buried, we know that his relics are there somewhere. His head was exposed on London Bridge, and thank goodness, his dear daughter Margaret begged for the guards to give the head to him after the period when it had rotted, and the head was thrown down to her husband. I think this is the story, thrown down to a boat beneath the bridge. And Roper took the head, the husband, the son-in-law, and put it in a vault in the church of St. Dunstan, outside the west gate of Canterbury, which is now the Anglican Church of St. Dunstan, and you can go to the spot and honour the relics of St. Thomas More in that church there. Let me read this prayer from St. Thomas More. Give me, good Lord, a longing to be with thee, not for the avoiding of the calamities of this wicked world, nor of the pains of hell neither, nor so much for attaining the joys of heaven, as even for a very love of thee. He died for love of Jesus Christ. He died for love of the Holy Catholic Church. He died for conscience and for truth. He died, in effect, as a stand against tyranny and unjust abuse of power. He was canonized with St. John Fisher in 1935, and now, just a few days ago, we celebrate their feast together each year. What a wonderful pair. St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More, pray for us. Nice to share this lovely story of his life with you. We'll be back again tomorrow morning. If you're watching live, I'm sorry I'm not streaming tonight because I've got another Zoom conference. So really nice to be with you. God bless.